speakers had to get up and get it started for me. A little weary here. But we've got three bright-eyed panelists. They just seem to never tire out. They just are like the energized battery. They just keep on going. I've got a question that was submitted by somebody that handed me this, and I'll read this for the first question, and then you be thinking of questions that you want to ask. And we might even take a couple of carryover questions concerning the eldership, because two or three of you remarked to me, well, I wanted to ask this. And so if you still have that in mind, well, we'll let you ask a couple. However, the forum this afternoon is primarily about deacons and their work. But here's a question that was given to me, and I'm not sure exactly what was meant, but here's what it says. Although a case could possibly be made grammatically that an elder must have a plurality of offspring, can that case be made regarding deacons too? I'll let you handle that, Gary.
I don't think the case can be made for the elder. Where's the grammatical case for the elder having to have a plurality of offspring?
Whoever asked the question, let them answer.
I didn't hear any evidence offered. Frankly, I don't believe it. And you can prove that, I think, by various ways. In fact, you could prove it right here in this very building. When you go down the hall, and maybe some of you ladies are looking for the restroom, and you see the door that says women, and if you're not with another woman, does that mean you can't walk through that door? You know, it makes absolutely no sense, either reasonably or scripturally, that an elder has to have a plurality of children. Biblical evidence for that, I would mention several things. First of all, the Levirate law. If a man died leaving no children, does that mean he had to have more than one? And his brother would marry his widow and so forth? Does that mean he had to have more than one child? Is that what that's saying? Everybody knows that's not the case. Who was it? Rachel that prayed for children. And when she got her first child, she said the Lord answered her prayer, but she just got one. So where's the evidence that children used in that kind of grammar means it has to be more than one? Everything biblically and reasonably militates against that. And therefore, if that's the case with elders, then the same thing would be true of deacons, certainly.
You want to say something? You want me to? In Genesis 21 and verse 7, concerning Sarah, she said, "Who would have thought that Sarah would have given children suck? For I have borne him a man-child." Children? She just had that one, didn't have any others. And yet, she uses the plural term because that includes her being placed in a group of those that generally had children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, Ephesians 6. What if there's just one child? Does that apply? And when you really get close to an individual, you get down to their pocketbook. What about the income tax, where it says, list children who are dependents? I'll guarantee you, those that make the argument that it's plural, if they just have one, will put down that one as a deduction. And yet it says children. Someone said, how many children do you have? You don't say, I don't have children. If you have one, you say, I have a son or a daughter. Now that's the application. How could it include all under general circumstances without using the plural? And that is what it says, having believing children. And It means offspring. It includes one or more, even though the plural is used. It includes the singular in these other passages and many others, but that's enough, I think, to prove the point. The Lord wasn't trying to determine how prolific an elder is to make him more qualified. It's what he's done with those offspring that's important. That's the thing he wants, a demonstration of the fact that he rules his own house well. Not to give him experience, although it'll give plenty of that, but and there may be a case made that it's harder to rear one child than it is to rear 3 or 4, or maybe in the case of my family, where I'm number 7, there were 8 of us, and that may be easier. I always felt like I had, since I had 4 sisters, that I had 5 mothers. And I think they thought that they had the right to rule me like that. And even today, if they gave an order, I'd jump. And it may be easier to be a child, like in a family like that. I know you get supervision, a lot of it, especially when you're number 7 down the list. But at the same time, the fact is that this is to show capability that the elder already has. He's ruled well his own house. And if he can't do that, how can he take care of the church of God?
Owen, do you have anything to add?
Well, just the same thing that these brethren talked about. What about a needy widow if she have children that believe? What if she just had one child? So he have no obligation to his mother. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's same principle on all these.
All right,
I've
I
never
feel
thought
like
of this restroom argument before, but
And when you go to a restaurant and you see a sign that at the door that says no dogs allowed, and you just have one dog, you can go right on in with that one, you know?
All right, let's take a question now concerning deacons. There's bound to be somebody out there with a question. Okay. Identify yourself first.
Rick Parker. I'm a student here at Brown Trail. As far as deacons and elders both, they're supposed to have believing children to be qualified for that position. If a deacon or an elder is appointed into that position with the believing children or child, and years down the road those children fall away, should they be taken out of that office or be allowed to stay in that office as deacon or elder?
Where do we read that a deacon must have believing children? I must have missed that passage. Yeah, ruling his children well, but it doesn't say they must be believing. Do you, brethren, believe deacons must have believing children?
No. They must be loyal to the parents.
Obedient to the parents, but it doesn't say they have to be Christians.
But with an elder, it does mention.
Yeah, it's difference in wording between the elder and the deacon.
If you look at the fact that he says, one that rules well his own house. Now you just think with me a minute. How did that elder get his own house from his father? How did it become his own house? There must have been a time when that elder was under his father's house, but he's not now. He has his own. He's free from the father, and no longer is the father accountable for him. The same thing is true with his children. I'm thankful that I have 2 children, both of them faithful members of the church, but they are in their 50s, and surely that doesn't leave me accountable for their actions now. But when they were growing up, it was a different matter, and I trust I ruled them well. But some do that, and they still go away. Somebody said, well, what about Proverbs 22:6? Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he'll not depart from it. In other words, you're going to make that mean the impossibility of apostasy? The Proverbs are general sayings that generally are true. A soft answer turns away wrath. I saw a fellow give a soft answer one time, and he got slapped. What about Jesus? When a man's ways please the Lord, it makes his enemies to be at peace. Jesus' enemies crucified him. He pleased the Lord perfectly, but his enemies weren't at peace with him. That's a general rule. Now, the general rule is if you train up a child in the way he should go, he'll not depart from it. But there is the possibility, not the probability, but the possibility of apostasy. And they can leave that. Jesus is called the shepherd and bishop of our souls. But there was one close to him, one of the 12, that apostatized. Did that disqualify Jesus of being our bishop? I think we need to give consideration to this. On the other hand, if a man has children and all of them went away, I think there ought to be flags raised. Did he really train them properly? That would be a question that he'd need to have some insight on.
Owen, let's hear from you.
Ezekiel 18 shows that Proverbs 22, verse 6 is not an absolute. It is a general principle, but the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. And Ezekiel says that several times in that chapter.
You have anything to add, Gary?
Brother Perry does. Perry Cotham has something that he wants to add.
Brother Cotham.
Yes, Perry Cotham. Was Phoebe deaconess in the church in Cenchrea from Paul's statement in Romans 16 concerning her? And if so, what about women being deaconesses in the churches today as in the denominational worlds being promoted?
Never known of Perry Cotham to stir up trouble before like this. He told me ahead of time he was going to ask this question. I told him, I'm going to throw it right back at you and let you answer it. Well, I think we can come up with an answer that we would, most all of us, I think, would agree on. The reference is Romans 16:1, and you have Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea. And by the way, if you're ever in the Arab world, don't pronounce that place name. I did it one time, and they all laughed and looked embarrassed. It must mean something in Arabic language. I don't know. I never did find out what. But put a hard K on it or something, change it up. But anyway, does that mean she was holding an office? And the corresponding question that goes along with that, what about 1 Timothy 3:11? Are those deaconesses? And I think we could give a little rundown on that, probably spend more time than we should on it, but there are certain arguments that that these were deaconesses. And let me just sort of outline what they are. When you come to 1 Timothy 3, and you're reading there from the beginning of the chapter about the qualifications of the bishop or elder, and then you come down to verse 8, you have deacons in like manner must be. Notice that, in like manner. And then you come down to verse 11, women in like manner must be. And so people have said, you can see he's got three categories of church officers, some would say. And those are the bishop or elder, and the deacons, and the bishops or elders, plural, and deacons, and then these deaconesses. And they said that they would say, well, you got Romans 16:1 that confirms that. You've got just a reasonable argument you could make is that deacons in their ministering work are relieving the needs of people in benevolent ways, and therefore interacting with needy women would naturally, in certain situations, need women to minister to those women, where it would be in some ways maybe inappropriate for them, and therefore deaconesses would reasonably be required. And they have qualifications, and these qualifications look just like the qualifications for deacons. They match up, and besides, it does not say in the Greek text their wives, as you have it in the King James. It says wives in King James, doesn't it? And you know, in the Greek, wife and woman, you just have one word. It means both, and the interpreter or the translator has to decide in any given context whether this is talking about a wife or simply a woman, because there's no separate word, distinct word for wife. The same thing is true of husband and man. And the word there, T-H-E-I-R, does not occur in the Greek text. It just simply says the women also. And so it leaves us with the problem of having to figure out what women is Paul talking about. Is he talking about perhaps wives? And if so, is it the wives of elders? Is it the wives of deacons? Or does he have a separate category here of women servants that we can call deaconesses, and Phoebe was one of those? And people who have argued for the deaconess have said, when we go to second century Christian literature, we see the deaconesses in place in the church. But that's not much of an argument, is it? When you go to second century Christian literature, you also see a monarchical bishop. That means one. And that's not right. That's not biblical. So they were already beginning to change things in the second century, so we can't argue anything on second century practice. Frankly, I think that Phoebe was simply a woman who was in some way serving that church there at Cenchrea. I do not see any evidence whatsoever that she had been singled out with a group of women and appointed in some way like we appoint elders and deacons, and that Paul was simply acknowledging her service to that congregation.
Like so many of these words, they have general meanings and they have specific meanings. Now, Titus 2, the first few verses talk about the elderly women. They're older. They're elderly. They're not women elders. They're just older women. And I would suppose that in the general sense, every Christian ought to be a deacon, a servant. The word deacon, the Lord elevated that to the highest possible point by saying, he that be greatest among you, let him be the servant of you all. And I don't know any indication of an eldership that speaks more of their ability to lead than the quality of the deacons that work with them. That's a real tip-off as to their leadership ability. I would hope that every one of us would want to serve in every way we can. There's only one way Christ can be your Lord, only one, and that is for you to be his servant. If you're not his servant, he's not your Lord. You may call him that, but he'll say, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? The Lord, the last week or so that lived with his disciples, emphasized with the lesson of washing the feet, and let him who is greatest among you, unless you become as this little child, serving humbly. And when everyone's doing that, no one cares particularly who gets the glory except the Lord, then you really have something. But this office, it reminds me of a kid at camp once that had given us lots of trouble, and I said, you're going to have to settle down, buddy, or we're going to have to make arrangements. He said, you can't do anything to me because my daddy is a deacon in the church. And I suppose I was supposed to go like that. And I said, I'm going to call your daddy the deacon in church if you don't behave, and we'll see what he said. And he said, no, don't call him. Don't call him. don't call. But we're all supposed to be servants. And I'm really glad that we can do anything we can to build up the church.
Amen. Hardeman?
There's the fact that everyone who serves is a deacon. That's what the word means. And it's really a Greek word that we've anglicized and made an English form out of it. And it means one who serves. Even Jesus is called a deacon. In Romans, he is a servant of God. And in that sense, Romans 15:8, a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers. And that's talking about Jesus, a minister, and that's the word deacon that's found there. Not in an official capacity. Now, there were some who served in an official capacity, not as an office of honor, but rather as a work, and using the word office in that sense. And if you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 13, it says, they that have used or served as a deacon. The King James puts the word office in there, but it's not that. It's simply those who have served as a servant. Served as a servant? They were already serving, but now they are in a special classification. Philippians 1 and 2, Paul writes to the church in Philippi, and he mentions all the saints of God with the bishops and deacons. And so there are some special servants that make up that group. And that was found and existed not just then, but even in the book of Acts. Those in Acts the 6th chapter, those 7. 3 times the word deacon is used in some form or other about their work. And they are to be placed over this business of serving. That's one of the terms, deacon. They're deaconing the tables. By the way, those aren't food tables. The word trapeza that's used there is like our word bank or bench. It's talking about money tables. Money was being brought to the apostles and laid at their feet, and distribution was made to every man as he had need. Distribution of what? Not food. They're not handing out hash. They're serving money tables and distributing money. The apostles said they were too busy to do that, so you look out men whom we may appoint over this business. And they would already be servants of God, but now they become special servants. And in Harper's lexicon, he points out that the word trapeza, or the word for four-footed table, is used in Acts 6 to mean money tables. That's what they were distributing. Acts 4 are the same thing. They brought the prices of the things that were sold and laid them at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made. And so it was money tables that they were serving. And they have qualifications and hence are deaconing in that sense of the term. So you have people already serving, and if they have used the office of a servant well, they purchase to themselves a good degree and great boldness in the faith of our Lord. However, after you say all that, that eliminates women. The women aren't in that category of the deacons in 1 Timothy chapter 3. After you've eliminated that, there must also be under consideration the fact that in 1 Timothy chapter 5, there is a special group of women who are serving, not as deaconesses in the sense of a special office in that term, but qualified only if they've been married one time, brought up children, and are 60 years of age or above. Now, that's not talking about benevolence. You can be benevolent to anybody at any age. But this is talking about putting them into a work. And if you look at the qualifications, you will see that it's using hospitality and washing the saints' feet and relieving the afflicted, bringing up children. Those are special works. Out of that office or work that some women were placed in, they had to meet very strict qualifications. They were to refuse the younger women. Out of that came nuns. But it was a misapplication. They select young women to be nuns and then try to train them. Women who are never married. And yet these had to be married. They had to be widows, and they were not to be enrolled unless they were above 60 years of age. Now, certainly that's not talking about benevolence. If a widow that's 58 came to the church and you knew about her need, would you say, come back in 2 years? Why, she could starve to death by that time. You help them at any age in benevolence, but you don't enroll them in the number that's talking about of being special servants. You look at qualifications, and it'll tell you something about what they're going to be doing and the work that they're performing. So they evidently would be helping the sick, relieving the afflicted. They would be hospitable, and maybe in those days when they didn't have all of the facilities that we have for motels, being hospitable was very important. And bringing up children, maybe taking care of those of others' children. But they had to be 60 to start with. And not only that, they had to pledge never to marry again. And if they put off that pledge, they weren't faithful to what God had said. 1 Timothy goes into that very clearly in 1 Timothy 6.
Did you speak already? I've forgotten. It's been so long, I've forgotten.
Takes me a long time.
Yeah, what day is this? I just want to mention two things here that I think people tend to get hung up on. One is office, this word office. You know, do they fulfill an office? Office comes rather indirectly from a Latin word that simply means to perform a task or to do. And the other word is authority. And all authority in heaven and on earth belongs to Christ. What authority we have is delegated authority. And this idea, who's going to call the shots, who's going to be in charge, we're going to let the women be in charge and all that kind of thing. We get hung up onto that to where we almost forget most of this talking about people that are on benevolent committees and so forth. If we'll worry less about who's going to call the shots, who's going to control, who's going to make the decisions, and all of us really try to work, it will help to keep us from being so hung up on the words authority and office. Authority. I know preachers won't even call their office an office. They call it a study because office suggests they have some authority, and everyone knows preacher doesn't have any authority, you know. Well, let's get over the hang-ups on the words and just do what we can to serve the Lord.
Well, I'll come back and get another little postscript in on this before we finish it. By the way, Brother Cotham, at the age of, is it 92 right now, Perry? You're up to 92? Still asking the same question that I was asking back in college, and you probably were too. One day when I was in college, I was walking down the main corridor of the administration building, and here came one of my favorite Bible professors coming toward me. And I walked up to him, shook hands, and I said, "Brother, I have a question." I had a question almost every day for somebody. And I said, "Do you think we should have deaconesses in the church?" He said, "That's the wrong question. We've got deaconesses. The question is, what should we call them?" You know, going back to Perry's original question, the word for deacon in the Greek is diakonos, and that os ending is masculine. And you just knock off the last two letters, the OS, and you have deacon spelled with an I instead of an E. It's almost identical to English. If you have the feminine form of that, as does occur in Romans 16:1, it's diakona. But that's not the term found in second century Christian literature for this invented office of deaconess. There in second century Greek literature, it's diakonessa. That's not the term Paul wrote in in Romans 16:1. So we need to be aware of that. And secondly, another little postscript is this, along with what Hardman was saying, think about the women who served Jesus, and over you read in the scriptures that they were ministering unto him. Well, what does that mean? Were they holding some kind of office called minister or deaconess? Or no, we all know better than that. They were simply serving him, doing what they could. And so you can tell, as Hardman pointed out, from the 7 men in Acts there who were appointed by the apostles to serve, and they were serving, they were deaconing, but they weren't in any particular office that we can ever discover. Let me add one thing to the previous question. Just came to mind. Some you students in the school may like this. I think it puts the icing on the cake on that plurality argument. I want you to notice something in Matthew chapter 22. Here is a question where the Sadducees put a question to Jesus, an occasion where the Sadducees put a question to Jesus. They're always trying to trick him and trip him up, and they didn't believe in the resurrection. And so here they are putting a trick question to Jesus. In verse 24, Teacher, Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. But you go back and read the original in Deuteronomy 25:5, and here's the way it reads. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, singular. Aha, what does that tell you? You have in inspiration, in the Word of God, a son identified as children. You see there? And it goes to show that, and Jesus didn't say, no, you misquoted it. He didn't say that. He let that go because that part of it was okay. I mean, as far as Jesus was concerned, they were quoting it right. And it goes to show that the generic word children can mean one or more.
All right, let's move on to another question.
Let me say one thing.
Okay.
I think I said 1 Timothy 6. It's 1 Timothy 5, and that deals with.
No, you've got short-term memory loss. You actually said 5.
Right. I do. Go ahead.
Whoever's next.
Okay. I'm Richard Stevens. I preach at Holland Freeway Church of Christ, as you know. My question is it wrong for a congregation to appoint deacons when they have no elders?
Is it appropriate to appoint deacons if there are no elders?
Is it wrong to do so?
They become de facto elders. If you have deacons and no elders, well, they really become de facto elders. I mean, who's going to make decisions and figure out the budget and all? People do that, going back to Acts chapter 6 and saying, well, they had deacons without apostles there. I mean, without elders there. Of course, they had apostle. But I prefer in Acts 6 to call those fellows a benevolent committee. That's what that meant to.
Hardeman, would you or Gary like to add to that?
Well, it really, if they would serve in the capacity that they are appointed, that's to serve and not to rule, not to be the overseers of the church. The elders in the New Testament were over all the work of the church, even the financial part of it. Acts 11:28-30. The church at Antioch determined to send relief unto the brethren who dwelt in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders, not to that committee that was appointed in Acts 6, but sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. And so the elders are over all the work. I've heard people say the elders are over the spiritual affairs, deacons are over the financial and the material affairs. Well, that's not what you find in the Bible. And I think that it's unwise to try to appoint committees that are standing, that have some kind of blessing of authority to displace God's organization. We ought to stay with His organization. Acts chapter 14 and verse 23 shows that for a while congregations acted without elders, and then when they could, they appointed elders. And that's the way it should be done. And I think that you can reverse that question. Can a congregation serve with elders and no deacons? That might be an interesting thing for these two to consider.
In the general sense, if we're all deacons, they'll be in good shape.
That's right.
In the specific sense, if they don't have them, don't put the name on someone and pretend that they are that when they're not. But you know, brethren, this thing that these questions are being raised about is a real issue that's coming before the church. 100 years ago, the first Christians just went right after these deaconesses, and they became de facto elders. And the same thing will happen again if we don't differentiate between the office of elder and deacon in 1 Timothy 3 and just the general sense of older people and members of church as servants. There's a general sense and there's a specific sense, and we must know the difference.
I once preached by appointment. In fact, it was the very first place I ever preached at all. It was where I preached my first sermon and the next several sermons. And by the way, my sweet and lovely wife was there on that day when I was 17 years old and preached my first sermon. She got to hear me from day one, poor thing. But that congregation had 2 members, and they were both women. Now, that's an interesting situation. Could they have deaconesses in that congregation? Or how about elderesses? Neither one of those women used such terms, but of course it's obvious they were controlling everything. They had to. There was nobody else. So, you know, now when we men came in and preached, they didn't try to get up and do anything, you know. They sat there and I took Sonny and I took my college roommate and his girlfriend, and the 4 of us went, and he led singing, I preached, we both together waited on the Lord's table, we shared leading prayers. And, you know, we had to do everything. It was just us 2 guys and those 2 women that were there plus the 2 we brought along. And that was it. So, you know, you can imagine situations where it's not typical and it's not ideal, and you do whatever is appropriate in that situation. I think if no preacher came on a given Sunday and it was just those 2 women there, then certainly one of them could give a lesson. Why not? Even if it's the Lord's Day, and even if it's the assembly where they're having the Lord's Supper, why not? It's just women. There's no element there of somehow usurping authority over a man. So that goes back to sort of the situation we're talking about here. What if later on there were 2 men in that congregation, and they were both men who could qualify to be elders, and so they became elders of that congregation, and there's no other men. Couldn't they be elders without deacons? And if not, why not? I agree with what both of these brothers have said. There's some cautionary things, you know, about having deacons without elders, but As Hardman pointed out, I don't know of any scriptural reason why that couldn't be the case, why they couldn't go ahead to be appointed to do the work that they would be doing under the elders and answerable to the elders. But in this case, they're answerable to the men of the congregation in the general business meeting. And as long as they don't step above their work, as Owen pointed out as well.
I think you can see that there are a lot of things that God didn't regulate about the work of deacons. And I think that was by divine wisdom. If he had regulated certain jobs that belong to them, then what about other jobs that may come up, other responsibilities that might need to be met? And I think it's by divine wisdom that he doesn't give detailed information about the work that they are to do. But they had them in the congregations. Philippians 1:1 is very clear on that. And 1 Timothy 3 wouldn't have set the qualifications generally where it does elders unless they were to be in the congregations. But a congregation could exist without deacons if you want to have elders first, unless you appoint them both at the same time. It would be that one would precede the other. And as is true often in congregations that are in a dying area, maybe a community that is not as populous as once it was, and the church begins to fade out, maybe there are no qualified individuals to serve as deacons. Maybe 2 elders still alive. And must they resign just because that there are no deacons? You can see that God left some things to judgment with regard to that matter, and even to selecting and appointing. While he set the qualifications, there are no details that are given about how they went about that selection. Did they put their names on paper and hand them in? Did they put them on the board? Did they announce them? We don't have those details. The selecting is generic. Look ye out among you, and then the qualifications are specific, and then we may appoint, and we don't know how they went about that either over this business. And in Acts 6, and that ought to serve as an example even for selecting and appointing elders, but we do not have 1, 2, 3, this is the way to do it. The details are lacking in large degree.
That's divine wisdom too.
I think so.
Yes, sir, the silence of the scriptures.
Next question. Millard Smith and Brother Davis. Brother Davis, I think, is next.
I have a 2-part deal. First of all, for Brother Workman, isn't the word diakonos a second declension noun? And as such, there is no feminine ending, and isn't Phoebe called by the same word that they are called in 1 Timothy 3? It's
right. Thank you for that correction.
Yes. And the second part I have is when we appoint women as church secretaries, as being over benevolence pantries or clothes closets, are we not appointing them as special servants to serve the church? And as such, are they not deaconesses?
Here's the general use again. You have a generic and a specific. Surely, generically, they are.
That goes back to the fact that all women are to serve, and we all serve the Lord. We use our talents and our capabilities to do that. But there is a use of the word that is not tropical. Isn't that true, Jerry? That there is a use of the word deacon that is not tropical.
It looks like we often make distinctions without a difference. If you look at what Roy Lanier Sr. wrote, and even what Brother C.R. Nicols wrote, where he advocated our calling the women who serve as deaconesses. In other words, these are women who are appointed to accomplish a certain task. Just as when we appoint men as deacons, we appoint them to accomplish a certain task. And it looks like to me that we are making a distinction without a difference, because we can appoint Brother Jones to be Sunday school superintendent over the adult Bible classes, and we can appoint Sister Smith to be superintendent over the children's classes, and they do the same thing, but we can call Brother Jones a deacon, but we can't call Sister Smith a deacon?
But there is a difference. There's a difference made in 1 Timothy 3. A deacon, is to have a wife. Well, a deaconess, we're not getting into anything like that, There is a difference.
I didn't hear Brother Jerry's answer to my question. Is there not a use of the word deacon when it is not tropical or general in its use?
As a technical term.
Yes. Yeah. And it is because in 1 Timothy chapter 3, it says, let these also first be proved, and then let them use or serve as deacons. Now, they're already serving generally, but there is to be a service here that is not tropical. And Philippians 1:1 uses it in that sense of not being general. All the saints of God, every one of them servants. Right. But with the bishops, overseers, that's not tropical, not even of the older men or older men and women. That's a special group. And then it says, and deacons. That's not tropical either. They've already been tropically included in the use of the word saint, but now there's a special group of them, which means it's not tropical, it's specific toward a special group. And the same thing in Acts 6. Those that were appointed to deacon over that business, that's not a tropical use of the word.
Of course,
yes.
in Acts 6, you don't have the noun form, it's all verb forms. As a matter of fact,
they
are not even called deacons. The only designation we have of any of those is Philip, and he's called an evangelist later on.
Right. That's true. But at the same time, if they are deaconing, you'd have to say they're deacons.
Yes, and that's what I would say about the women who serve if they are deaconing, if they are serving.
Tropically or specifically? If it's specific, I want to know where the qualifications are.
Well, I would hold that 3:11, as even Brother Robert Taylor pointed out in this lectureship about 20 years ago, he held that 1 Timothy 3:11 was talking about women who serve the church. And I think 3:11 does talk about women who serve the church.
If you know the deacon, if you know the wives of deacons, you know that they're called on for service. But it's general. It's not an office that women have. I see a great out that some want to take in eliminating deacons and putting women over committees and over men in committees. Every passage in the New Testament that restricts a woman restricts her from leadership capability over the man and goes back to the Garden of Eden, not to cultural things. Every passage goes back to the Garden of Eden and points out that God intended it that way from the beginning, not because of the culture of the first century.
I agree with Hardeman, and here's the reason why. And I think this is what Hardeman's saying, to boil that down and summarize. In the one case, you've got an ongoing group of people where one individual may have one specific task. Maybe out of this group of deacons, you have a man who was appointed to take care of something regarding maybe a building program the church was involved in. Well, that building program eventually comes to an end. And maybe for a while, he didn't have any specific task appointed to him at all, but he was still a deacon. He didn't quit being one of the group of deacons. Whereas in another case, where a congregation, let's say, has no elders or deacons, but one man is appointed to be the Bible class's supervisor, well, that's a specific task that's appointed to him, and if somebody else wanted to come along and take over that work, well, then he maybe wouldn't be doing anything specific at all, and nobody would think of calling him a deacon. Because he was just assigned that one specific task. Somebody asked me out here in the aisle, I guess it was yesterday, what do you think a preacher should be appointed deacon? I said, well, he already is one. In a generic sense, Paul wrote to Timothy here in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 6, if thou put the brethren in mind of these things, thou shalt be a good minister. That's diakonos there. And yet, what's the name of Timothy's wife? I don't think he had one, did he? At least we don't know anything about her, if he did, and probably didn't. And yet, over in chapter 3, you read here that in verse 12, let deacons be husbands of one wife. So as far as I'm concerned, that group that is specifically appointed as a group of deacons, whatever you want to use for the noun there, college of deacons, deaconship, or any term you might want to invent, that group of men who were specifically appointed to be an ongoing group of special servants, they had to be the husbands of one wife. But I think a bachelor preacher doesn't have to. And I think that a man who is appointed simply to run the Bible classes could be a bachelor and wouldn't have to be a married man. You see the difference? I think we've got to distinguish between an ongoing group of people and some individual that is appointed simply to carry on a specific task.
Brother Millard Smith.
We've been referring to these men as a group of men, like the elders are a plurality. I'm assuming then that deacons must be in the plurality as well?
The only congregation we have reference to them as a group puts the plural on it. Philippians 1. In the church in Philippi, they had a plurality of them because he mentions the saints of God which are at Philippi, specifically a congregation, with the bishops, plurality of them, elders, and deacons, plurality of them.
Brent, Brother David Hester has a question right over here. Robert Dodson. Man, there's a whole bunch of questions out there.
It might clear this thing up because in the King James at least, it uses the word office in regard to elders, chapter 3, verse 1, and deacons, chapter 3, verse 10, and the deacons again in verse 13. But is that word office in the original Greek at all?
There's no word for office.
No word for office at all? That word is not even there? So there's no really distinction made between an elder except the fact that some are appoint elders in every city. There's not really that word office is there. So if it were there, that would truly clarify this discussion about the difference in a person doing the work of a deacon without being in the office of a deacon, or the work of an elder without being in the office of an elder.
The translators of the King James Version took one word, which we could translate bishopric, and expanded that to office of the bishop, you see? But there's no separate word for office there at all.
Okay, my mother-in-law says, I heard a preacher say that a deacon had to have one qualification that elders did not have to have, and that's to be a good businessman.
Yeah. That would probably help him in a lot of ways, especially if he's on the budget committee.
About the service of every individual within the church, as the Lord said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, it says, take heed that you do not Do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by men, otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. He goes on to say that that way your reward is in secret as you do things in secret. And with the service in mind and about the word about office being just a word that has been used.
That's right.
You know, as a deacon, if you're seeking to do service and, you know, you do it in this way.
Hold the mic up.
If you're seeking to do service and you do it the way the Lord says to do service and do deeds here, then, you know, I believe that's the characteristic a deacon should have, not to just obtain a title that is, you know, reputable by other people.
David Hester, I just wanted to make a comment about what the gentleman said concerning women who are possibly put over certain classes and that they are not called deaconesses while the men who are put over classes are called deacons. It's not necessarily the case. Just because a man is put over by the elder selected to be responsible for a group of classes, it doesn't automatically make him a deacon unless he is already a deacon, unless he has already met the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3 and has met those qualifications fully. Just because a man is put in a certain position by the elders does not automatically make him a deacon. And likewise on this matter of 1 Timothy 3:11, if you'll notice, there are 3 verses prior to that that deal with the qualifications of deacons and 2 verses after that that deal with qualifications of deacons. I have always took verse 11 to be the wives of the deacons. That has been always the way that I have seen it, at first blush and then also in further study. And I know there are some great and good men that have taken positions, they're not in the majority by any means, but I know there's some notable men that you have cited that do take position that there are to be deaconesses. But I'm not convinced of that. I respect Robert Taylor immensely, but I don't think he would even press the point, knowing him. But still, the fact of the matter is, this question of whether we can have deaconesses, it gets back, I think, to what the gentlemen on the panel have brought up, is that there are those among us who want to use that as a springboard for women having authority over men. And I think we have seen the bitter fruit of that, and I continue to see it. There's a website, Galatians328.org, that if you haven't seen it, if you go to it and read it, you will be amazed at some of the things that is on that website. About one lady who received an invitation from one of our universities to come and speak in a seminar about preaching. And she considered it a great day because there are now refreshing breezes blowing in our fellowship. You know, I'm not one to say the slippery slope argument applies in every case, but in this I believe it does. We cannot have deaconesses simply for the fact of where it would lead.
I think if you go to church history, it's very clear that there was only a slight mention of deaconesses in the first 2.5 centuries. And even then, those slight cases may have been a generic use or tropical use of the word, rather than using it in the specific sense of an office. You have to come down to about 253 AD before you run into any group of women that you could definitely say, these evidently are occupying an office called deaconess. And that is when Origen, about 253, speaks of them. And in the Western Church, you have about the same thing. It was about 220. Tertullian begins to use the term for an office of women. Up until then, it's not used. Why? If they were so prevalent, and every woman is a deacon, but not a deacon in the specific sense, why wouldn't it have been used all those centuries? And it isn't. So historically even, those who want to make the office of women deaconesses are lacking from historical points as well.
Let me comment on what Dave said about wives of deacons. Do you still hold that view, you're saying? That it seems like it's, yeah. Usually the way the argument goes on that, I don't know if this is the way you would argue it or not, but usually the way the argument goes to say these are the deacons' wives is that you start in with the deacon section in verse 8. So first of all, it occurs in the middle of the deacon section of this chapter. Secondly, looking at the sequence of verses, of course we all know Paul didn't number the verses, but the way they're versed out for us now, you would have then the deacons' wives in verse 11, and then mentioned, and then you would have his children mentioned in verse 12. So they say it seems logical. You got the deacons, you got something said about their wives, you got something said about their children, and therefore it must be the wives of the deacons by noticing the sequence of verses 11 and 12. But I don't quite see it that way, Dave, and here I'm going to try to convert you to this viewpoint. If these are wives at all, it seems to me that they are wives of both the elders and the deacons. Why? Just starting with common sense, if deacons' wives must be qualified, why wouldn't elders' wives need to be qualified? You know, just from a common sense standpoint, you would think that. But secondly, on that sequence of verses argument, I don't think it's verse 11 followed by verse 12 that clinches it for being wives of deacons. I think it's the sequence of verse 10 followed by verse 11 that clinches it for being the wives of both. Yeah. In verse 10, yeah, right, you have this, and let these also besides who? Besides the elders. Right. So we're talking about both deacons and elders must first be proved. And so you have both groups here that Paul has discussed so far mentioned in verse 10, and therefore the women in verse 11, it seems to me logically must be the wives of both.
Very good point, Gary, and I really agree with you on that the elders' wives should meet the same qualifications as the deacons' wives there in verse 11. It makes sense. And good point, and I firmly agree with you on that.
Well, I'm glad I got one convert today anyway. But.
Who's next? Identify yourself first.
Weldon McKinney from the Legacy congregation. J.A. and I are so good of friends, but boy, we sure disagree on some issues, and we go on and on about it for hours, but our love always continues. Strangely, I ought to be up there because I'm not going to ask you a question, I'm going to make a comment. When I look into 1 Timothy and I read about the role of a woman in the church, then when I get to 1 Timothy chapter 3, I understand that that is referring to the wives, not just women, but women who are wives of the deacons and the elders. These women couldn't have a place of authority in the church and have the same inspired writer tell exactly in chapter 2 that the women are to be submissive and not have authority over the man in the church. Is that correct? And the second part I'd like to say is, Brother Nichols, chapter 5, and by the way, I've always tried to figure out what the age of Phoebe was. And I've always figured she is over 60. But I love chapter 5, and if we would really apply chapter 5 to the church today, and the care ministry, really we're talking about the work of elders and deacons. Every one of us in this room today know the women are the best workers in the church. Always have been, and they will continue to be. But if we use these women as carefully as we should in the church today, instead of hiring all these different ministers for every different ministry, we'd revolutionize the Lord's body. And we would become so attractive to others because of the care that we show and the love for one another. So I just base that on what you said, and maybe you gentlemen have a comment on that.
I say amen to that. I believe that always the greatest factor of work in a congregation generally is the latest Bible class. They always were right in the heart and center of so much of the work. Thank God for that.
Brother Robert Dodson.
First, I wanted a clarification and then maybe a couple of comments. But did you say, Gary, that there wasn't a feminine form of the word deacon?
Yeah, it's been so long since I looked at that, and I didn't bring a Greek New Testament with me, and so our brother here kindly reminded me there is no feminine form of diakonos. And I was thinking Paul had used it there, but he's right, and it came back to me when he said it. He had to use the masculine form because there's no feminine form, but he did not use diakonessa, which came in later in 2nd century Christian literature, so the point is still the same. Paul used this word that is used generically in many passages for simply a servant rather than the specific term that meant deaconess.
Okay, I think that'll help with my comments too. As Brother David pointed out, there are 2 verses that follow speaking of the women in 1 Timothy 3:11, and it says, "Let deacons be the husbands of one wife." A long time ago, somebody asked Guy in Woods if a woman could serve as an elder, and he said, "Sure, as long as they're the husband of one wife." And I think the same thing would apply to deacons, male or female, as long as they're the husbands of one wife. Of course, nowadays with homosexuality and homosexual marriages, that might be a problem. But I think my point is that in order to serve as a deacon in the church, whether it be male or female, they must be the husband of one wife. Obviously, we're talking about males, male servants, male deacons. And so I would agree with David that the women there are the wives of the elders and deacons, as you pointed out.
And you're saying that since Phoebe was a diakonos and she obviously had no wife, therefore she wasn't a specific diakonos in the specific technical term sense of it, but rather in the generic sense that Hardeman calls tropical.
Not a deacon. She was not a deacon as the term is used in 1 Timothy 3.
Right. But rather as it's used in the generic passages.
And you have that in 1 Timothy. Chapter 5 mentions elders, talks about the older women, older men, but it also mentions youngers. That's not an office. That's just dividing them into 2 categories. Same thing's true. If you can have elders who are not elders, I don't mean by that they're missing and neglecting their work, but they can be older and not be elders. And you've got that in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Mm-hmm. Now, if that's true of elders, why not of deacons? Every Christian is a deacon, but not a deacon.
Good.
In the specific sense.
Actually, on this thing of these generics and specifics, I'd like to change pace just a little bit and talk about the politics of all of this that we see in local churches and how a fella I'm not trying to judge his heart, but he may be working to get up to the first level of the eldership, training to be a junior elder, and he's a deacon now, he's halfway there or something. I think that kind of thing is really faulty thinking. And I think of what a dear old sister said years ago. We appointed some new deacons in the congregation. She said, well, I hope that they do better than the last bunch. Said the last bunch were hard-working servants until we put them in the deaconate, and they just sat down and quit. It's still a matter of function. Let's work all that we can do. To me, a good group of deacons is a bunch of good old boys that they're ready to do anything that they can do to help the church.
1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, and verse 13, it points out that these deacons, those who use or serve as deacons, purchase to themselves a good degree. And that term actually comes from the word good. That means beautiful. they purchased to themselves a beautiful work. The same thing is said about Mary. She did a beautiful thing, a good thing. But the word good there is from the word that means beautiful. And so there are some acts of beauty that the deacons can perform in the faithfulness that they serve in the congregation. And that requires qualifications. It includes, surely, being one who serves just not in material things, but spiritual things. As Jerry pointed out, that we find Stephen, as well as Philip, in the book of Acts, evangelizing. And that's still service.
Brother Grant Puckett.
Grant Puckett here at Brown Trail, and I'm actually one of the deacons here. And so my question is, if a deacon is a special servant, but all Christians are servants, what should we be doing as deacons that makes us special? What are we doing beyond what every Christian should be doing, other than having the qualifications found in the Bible?
Your own call to do whatever good you can.
I have a question as well. Some people say that in 1 Timothy 3 that Paul is not talking about the alcoholic beverage, because if he is, then that gives deacons a horrible excuse to drink. But is Paul talking about an alcoholic beverage?
You're talking about where he says to Timothy, drink no longer water, but
not given to much wine.
Not given to much wine.
Yes, and then it tells the elders not given to wine.
It's hard for me sometimes to understand the questions. I know one time one fellow asked me on that very passage, he said, how much is too much? I said, what? He said, well, it says not given too much wine. I said, it's not T-double-O. It's given to. It really carries with it the idea of alongside. In other words, he's not a wino.
I knew a fellow one time who was a preacher, but not full time. He was a vocational preacher. He held down a job, and he'd ride a bus every day to work. And there was a certain man that got on along the way, along that bus route, would get on, and these two became friends and would always sit with each other. One day he was telling me, he said, yesterday I got on that bus, and then my friend got on at his stop, and he was just beaming and looking so happy. And I said, what's happened? And he said, well, yesterday at church I was appointed a deacon in my church. And so my friend said, well, tell me, what's the difference between an elder and a deacon? Now, see, this other man was not in the Lord's church. I don't know if they even had elders. And he said, tell me, what's the difference between an elder and a deacon? And the man said, oh, that's easy. Paul said that an elder should not be given to wine, and he said that a deacon should not be given to much wine. So elders can't drink, but deacons can drink a little. And that was it, apparently. Very simplistic answer. I forgot what your question was already.
It's not the alcoholic beverage because that gives deacons
Is it alcoholic? Well, if it was, you know, there are those who argue that all wine in the Bible is non-alcoholic. If that were the case, how did those people get drunk? And why did the Jews accuse the apostles on the day of Pentecost as being drunken with new wine? What does that mean, being drunken with grape juice? You know, they wouldn't be drunken at all if it was simply nothing more than grape juice. Now, it's true that they had very low alcoholic content, and they diluted that even further with water and probably got it down to where it was extremely weak. But still, if a person just really guzzled a gallon of the stuff, I guess he could get drunk on it, and that must be what the accusers on the day of Pentecost thought the apostles had done. The same thing, I think, would apply here in 1 Timothy 3. There would be no reason for Paul to write not given to wine at all if it was not a harmful beverage. He didn't write, don't be given to orange juice or don't be given to milk. You know, there's got to be some reason why they shouldn't be given to that, and that means, by the way, addicted to it. So it stands to reason that it had to have some, however small, alcoholic content.
To means that they can't have any, or you say not addicted to?
Well, now, I'm going to answer that question with a little cautionary statement. Just because we learn something about a culture where something was practiced doesn't necessarily mean that it should apply in our situation in a different culture. But in the culture of the Middle East, that grape juice, without the invention of refrigerators, it naturally had a certain amount of fermentation. Otherwise, the parable of Jesus about the old and new wineskins makes no sense at all. If it's not fermenting at all, it's not expanding at all, and the parable is irrelevant. We know it had a certain amount of alcoholic content. I don't think it's right in the cases of that I have seen certain books written where they try to prove that there was absolutely no alcoholic content whatsoever. I don't think it can hold up. And you have the statements about being drunken with wine. How they get drunken with wine if it had no alcoholic content. So that, but having said that, I must hasten to say that we lived in the Middle East for a while, 3.5 years in Lebanon. I never saw one drunk man or woman. Never saw one person drunk, intoxicated. Why? Because it was an extreme scandal, and still is today, in the Middle East for anyone to be drunk. And that's true both in Arab and Jewish culture. And we do have, I think we have to acknowledge there was that alcoholic content, and Paul told Timothy, be no longer a drinker of water, but take a little wine for your stomach's sake. Why only a little if it's just pure grape juice? So I think there was reasons why they needed to drink that, because water was very harmful. And the wine diluted with water with a small amount of alcoholic content would save them from diseases that they would get from that perverted, corrupted water. And that's why Paul advised Timothy, who was having stomach problems, you better get off that water and start drinking a little wine. But he didn't say drink a lot of wine. He said drink a little wine. And in other words, if he had drunk to the point of intoxication, then it would be a sin.
Let me inject one thing, Hardeman. I don't believe we gave quite enough time to Grant Puckett's question. If all Christians are to be servants, what then is the distinction between that and being a deacon? Is that your question, Grant? Owen answered just a little bit, but I didn't hear any answer from you or from Gary on that.
I believe there to be a standing committee. In other words, they are a standing committee of servants that are ready to be used in various capacities. But they're going to be serving just like the others, except maybe in more intense ways, but not for an honorary position. It's not that at all.
Well, I agree with that, and you know, I guess we feel like the answer's pretty simple and brief, and it doesn't. And if a man's doing a certain job, I mentioned a building project. Maybe a deacon was appointed to look after the building project, and the building project comes to an end. Maybe there's a few weeks go by and he didn't have any specific job appointed to him, but he's still a deacon, and hopefully pretty soon the elders will think up some new task for the man. And but so he, like Owen said, he's on call. He's ready to serve in whatever capacity he can, and the elders would like to ask him to serve in.
We've got about 3 minutes left, and somebody is waving frantically back here. Brother Bob Stapleton.
He's going to look behind you. It seems to be that as we look at the Bible and as we talk about the role of the woman within God's economy, whether we talk about Old Testament or New Testament, that for the most part, from the very get-go, if you can use that terminology, God has been very clear, at least to me. And as we get up to the New Testament church, and as we look at the specific roles that are outlined within the New Testament, it appears that we as the men, and especially if there are elders in a congregation, that they may well endanger the souls of women within a congregation by putting them in roles they really have no right to be able to serve in. And it would seem to be that we would want to exercise the utmost of caution as we look at the Scriptures and as we try to find a place to fit women into God's economy. It's ridiculous to suggest that women don't have work to do within the church, but they have their work to do, just like elders have their work to do and deacons aren't to do their work. Deacons have their work and elders aren't to do their work. Preachers have their work and women have theirs. And it would seem to be we would want to be, as leaders of the church, very cautious that we don't endanger the souls of our wives or our sisters, whether we talk about physical or spiritual, in suscepting them to a position or an obligation or a responsibility or a work they have no right to do.
Very good. 3 quick responses up there.
I believe that is the essence of the need that we have today, and that is to encourage everyone to do the work that God has assigned them to do. And women can, in most congregations, they do the majority of the work. When you look at it, they're the ones that are doing the majority of it. Now, it's not public, it's not over the man. That's forbidden. Sometimes people say, well, 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and chapter 11 do not say that it's because of what happened in Eden. Yes, it does. It says, I suffer not a woman, or he says, let your women keep silence in the churches. And he points out that they're to be under subjection, as also saith the law. What law? Law of Moses doesn't say anything about that. The law in Eden that said, thy desire shall be unto thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. That's not a macho kind of rule. That's simply the kind of supervision that'll bless and enhance every relationship. So every indication in the Scriptures that points out the limit of the work of the woman is that she cannot serve over the man. That is, she is to be in subjection. And that goes back to Eden. Every passage goes back to Eden in establishing that.
Great comments, Hardeman.
Along that line, and to combine that back to what we were talking about regarding verse 11 with David and who that applies to, I'll repeat today what I said yesterday. It seems to me that we are on safe ground with 1 Corinthians 3:11 if we apply those qualifications both to the wives of elders, the wives of deacons, and any other women who are appointed specific tasks in the church.
1 Timothy.
What did I say? 1 Corinthians. Oh, 1 Timothy. Yeah, okay. Thank you. It's a long day.
Some others sort of slip sometime.
Yeah, and what was that? So I'm getting harder hearing too. But can you imagine, for example, the repercussions that would take place if there were a congregation where a woman was the ladies' Bible class teacher? I don't mean just for a day, but on an ongoing basis. She's a ladies' Bible class teacher, and she does not meet the qualifications of what is it, Corinthians or Timothy? 1 Timothy 3:11. And, you know, I mean, here Paul wrote, women in like manner must be grave, not slanderers. temperate, faithful in all things, but she can't meet those qualifications, and yet she's the ladies' Bible class teacher, and people in the community know she's not that kind of a woman. She's a gossip. She's a has an ungodly lifestyle, and yet she's teaching the ladies' Bible class down here at Brown Trail Church. What a tragedy that would be, you know. We've got to qualify, I think, women who are fulfilling specific tasks like that by this verse before we appoint them to the tasks.
Maxie, I think there are two things on all of this discussion of deacons, since we're talking about activity, doers, performers. We really need to work every way we can to facilitate action and obedience, and within the framework of the law, to be busy, all of us, doing everything we can in a general sense. Secondly, to get our minds on the spiritual things that are so important in church. We get so tied up in physical arrangements and charts and all. Let's get on with the spiritual things, teaching the lost, encouraging the weak, and doing everything we can to build up the church spiritually.
By the way, if you think that slip of my tongue was bad, I'll have to get a little story in here. I was preaching one Sunday morning on Jesus down in Jericho, and the wee little man Zacchaeus and the sycamore tree and all of that. And driving home, my wife asked me the question that every gospel preacher dreads to hear. She said, "Do you want to know what you said this morning?" And I said, "Oh, no, don't tell me." She said, "You said Jesus walked up to that sycamore tree and said, 'Nicodemus, you come down from there.'"
Well, I think this has been a very good session. We've had 3 great open forums, and I want to thank Hardeman Nichols and Gary Workman, because they've been on the forum every day, and I want to thank Owen Cosgrove. He's been on it 2 days, and I think all of them have done a great job. But we're going to have to end now, because we've got to take out some time to go eat.